Thank you, Jeff. And thanks for everybody showing up for our little walk through the IBC. Hopefully you're all caffeinated. We'll try to keep this interactive because you don't want to hear me talk about the ICC for 45 minutes. So we had my first laugh. Thanks, Dan. We probably can't get super specific if you have a concern about an underground MCC in Canada. We can talk about that later, but it's a general course. I can't convey everything I know about the ICC or the IBC in 45 minutes, but we're going to try. So here's our agenda. We're going to go through the history of the IBC. Where is your project, and what does that have to do with the IBC and what specific codes we're looking at? Who has jurisdiction? That's always a really intriguing one. What is it? What are we building? What's the occupancy? What's it made out of? How big can it be? What else do I need to know? Do we need sprinklers, fire separation? Do we need fire-rated shafts? How many exits do we need? And of course, pitfalls. So we've all been in the business for a while and we've had those projects, right? Those issues. How do we solve those problems? Can we learn from each other as we move forward? So, history of the IBC. History of the IBC started in 2000 when the ICC formed the IBC. The ICC is the International Code Council, and the ICC is the umbrella of all the international codes. National Fire Code, Plumbing Code, Mechanical Code, Green Construction Code, Fuel Gas Code, International Code of Existing Buildings. There's a huge number. These are the popular ones. There's probably 30 codes under the ICC. So who here remembers the UBC in Boca? Yeah. So pre-2000, the country was kind of divided up. You know, UBC was on the west, Boca was on the east. The standard building code, which everyone called the Southern Building Code because it was in the South. And anyone here from Wisconsin? They had their own Wisconsin special, right? Not to mention that New York, Chicago, LA, Kansas City, each of those states, or each of those cities had their own individual code. So, who has jurisdiction? Everywhere in the United States right now has some version of the IBC in place. Makes it a lot easier to understand, right? Canada, entirely separate, different project, different seminar. So who has jurisdiction? Well, it depends on where you're at. It could be the city, the county. It could be the state. It could be a third-party reviewer that's reviewing for one of the smaller municipalities. Then you get into states like Illinois, Texas. It's choose your own adventure. They don't have a standardized code that they use throughout. So you can have the 2015 here, 2018 here, 2021 here. Same thing with Illinois. There are a couple states like South Dakota that says you will use the 2021. Yeah, but you can change it. You can amend it however you want per jurisdiction. So it's standard-ish, right? Wisconsin, you file with the state. And not to be outdone, in Indiana, you file with the Department of Homeland Security. And they actually do a pretty good job, you know, anyway. Then zoning. So who does have jurisdiction? Here's one of my favorite projects. We had a facility that has county number 1. This little part is in county number 2. Across the river is county number 3. Since it's a navigable riverway, the Army Corps of Engineers had a say. Some DNR involved because it's a wetland. What isn't here is FEMA. And you know who had jurisdiction? The city. And the city was great to deal with, right? But you have all these things, you know, is your facility plotted correctly? Do you have 2 different counties? Where's my civil friends that want to talk watershed after this meeting? Watershed districts, we're not going to talk about watershed districts. We're not going to talk about air permits. We're not going to talk about Army Corps of Engineers. These are all aspects beyond the code that affect your project. Who's your insurance provider? That can be a big one. Our friends at FM Global have a long list of requirements. Some of those are mandatory-ish. Some of them are recommendations in order to get a better rate. And at some point, you have that conversation of, does it really pay to have all of these requirements, or do we just pay a bigger rate? So what is it? What's the occupancy? So we are in a B, we're in an office. And the lovely thing about having a code that was derived from other codes that were slammed together over the years is that once things get into the code, they're hard to get out. So I can tell you without a doubt that telephone exchange is a B because it is in the code, right? Fs. Fs are factories that make things that can burn. F2s are factories that make things that don't burn. You know, I was once told by a fire official, anything will burn if you get it hot enough, which is true. But in general, things that can burn are an F, F1. Things that don't burn are an F2. Storage, same thing. Things that can burn, like leather or fur, some of these antiquated things that are in the code still, those are an S1. If you have a warehouse full of ivory, it's an S2, right? So the things that we deal with, grains are an S1. Some of the things that we get into that are S2s, fertilizer. So if you have a mountain of potash, it's not going to burn. H's. H's go from 1, which is the most restrictive, to 5. H's are things that detonate, ammunition. H2s are things that have a deflagration concern. So flammable liquids, dust. So dust in the coal industry, dust in aluminum, dust in the ag industry. H3s are combustibles, so once again, flammable liquids, typically not under pressure. H4s are health, so toxics, corrosives, large quantities of acids. And H5 is semiconductor facilities. So how do we know if it is an H? We go to trustee table 307.1.1. That is, it's a much, it extends down, right? It's a big table, but they go by quantities. So if you have combustible liquids in a 3A, you're an H2 or H3, and you can have 330 gallons. And if you look at all the criteria for the footnotes, you can double that if you sprinkler, you can double that if you have it in a specific in a closed system and or in a fire room, a control area. Where it gets hard to quantify things are with dust. So it says dust, you see note Q. Note Q will take you to section 414.1.3, and that's the section that brings in dust hazard analysis. So then you do a dust hazard analysis, which we can also help you with. There's a couple sections specific to the grain industry. So combustible dust in grain processing and storage. So usually, to have this exception of unlimited height and area for a grain elevator, you have to take the position that it's an H. And along with that comes the whole criteria of an H. So you're sprinklering it, you'll have some issues with ventilation, you'll have issues potentially with backup generators. We don't typically take this approach because you don't typically want to have your entire facility called an H. What we can look at, well, in grinding rooms, because of the act of grinding and producing combustible dusts, are considered an H2. Once you are an H2, other requirements kick in. And this section calls out that if you're an H2, 3,000 square feet, you need a 2-hour separation. If you're larger than 3,000 square feet for a grinding room, which is a pretty good sized grinding room, then you're a 4-hour. And then there's all the other stuff. Architectural at VAA, we typically don't get into these things. We have done them, and we've done them in other lives. We've done jails and schools and courthouses, but that is not the business we're in at VAA. So there are a lot of requirements for assembly, education, institutional, mercantile we do. Residential in the IBC is not your typical home. It has to do with hotels, dormitories, those sort of things. And use. So use include grain silos that are residential. The only U that I know I've worked with is, remember that pig pen we did in Uganda? Yeah, that was a U. Not a lot of regulation in Uganda on a pig pen. So now we got an understanding of what our building is, what type, what occupancy it's going to be. What's it made out of? So you got 5 choices. You got type 1 and 2. Type 1 and 2 are non-combustible. Type 3 is non-combustible for your exterior walls. Your interior structure can be anything of any material. Type 4, non-combustible exterior, but your interior structure is heavy timber or solid timber. And in the 2021 code, now they have type 4A, type 4B, type 4C. And then type 5 is any material. So that's typically your wood construction. So what's the difference between 1 and 2? One of them is separation ratings. So if you're a type 1 and your bearing walls at type 1B, your primary structure, your exterior bearing walls, interior bearing walls have to have a 2-hour rating. If you're a type 2B, you don't have anything. So why would you want type 1? You can go a lot larger if you're type 1. So if you're all concrete and everything is a 2-hour, it may be of best interest to do a type 2 or type 1B. There's also distance criteria. So if you have a lot line or a distance to a building and you are 5 feet, if you're 5 feet to 10 feet, your type 1A, you have to have a 2-hour separation. All the others, you need a 1-hour separation. If you're 10 feet to 30 feet, this is a really critical number. So if you're over 10 feet to a property line, so if you're building to building, you're 20 feet away because you put your property line in the middle. If you're 20 feet, 10 to 10, and you're type 2B, there's no requirement for separation. How big can it be? So table 504 basically goes through the heights in feet. Pretty simple. 504.4 is heights in stories. So that sets the groundwork. Just about everything in the IBC has a follow-up. They'll tell you the rules, and then they tell you the exceptions. And the exceptions are part of the code. So general areas, we'll take an S. So if you have a non-sprinklered S1 storage, you can be, and it's a type 2B, you can be 17,500 square feet. If you have a sprinklered multi-story, you can be 52,500 square feet. The IBC gives you a lot of credit for sprinklering. So remember I said there was usually the code and the rules, and then there's some exceptions. So here's some of the exceptions to height. Special industrial occupancy, one of our favorites. It's one of those areas that they say if you need to be really tall or really big for your function, and you're a special industrial occupancy, you can be bigger than what the table calls for. You can be taller than what the table calls for. Typically, code officials will give us the criteria for height because most of our stuff works on gravity. You gotta get something up really high and then it comes down and gets cleaned and goes. It eliminates the need for additional bucket elevators. Not all code officials give you the allowance for area because they can point to a really small mill or a really small elevator and they said, well, they made it work. So typically we can get the allowance for height under special industrial occupancy. We can't always get the area criteria. Mezzanines and equipment platforms. The main criteria here is that mezzanines and equipment platforms are not stories. They don't count against your height in stories. They don't count in your area for egress. There are limitations on how big of an area you can have for equipment mezzanines and platforms, but they don't count against you. Frontage increase. You in the back, I hope you can't read this because we're not going to go through the actual text. We're going to go through a walkthrough specifically of this because it's rather confusing. Unlimited area. There are a couple of criteria where you can have unlimited area. So if you're a non-sprinklered F1 and F2, so those are things that don't burn, if you're single story, non-sprinklered, and you have 60 feet all the way around you, open, it could be unlimited area. If you are a single or two-story, B, F, S, or M, and you're sprinklered, and you have 60 feet all the way around you, you can be unlimited. Our first drawing. Frontage increase. Frontage increase is the area that is open to a public way, street, or yard. It doesn't have to be on the front. It can be on the side, it can be all the way around. So let's take this example. On the top, we have an F1. It's two-story, it's sprinklered, 30,000 square feet. From our table for allowances, a multi-story sprinklered F1 can be 57,000 square feet. So we're good. Our S1 three-story sprinklered is 60,000 square feet. So we go to our table and we're like, oh, it can't be that big. But wait, we may be able to make it work if we use frontage increase. So your frontage increase gives you allowances for anything over 75% of the area that you use. So the first 25% that you're open gets taken off. That's, you minus this 25%. That's part of the text. So we have 200, 300, 200. Yeah. you have 230 feet here, which leaves 70 feet here. So you have 770 feet out of 1,000 feet that's open, and it's greater than 30 feet. So anytime you're over 30 feet, you still use 30 as a denominator. So 77% times 1, you get 77% additional. For the 230, we're only 20 feet, so you times 2 over 3 times 2/3. You do all the math. You get a 67% increase times the original plus the original, so we're at 87,883 square feet. So we can make it work. That's what all these numbers mean. You take 25% that's required, that goes off. You get credit for anything above that 25% and greater than 20 feet. You can't use a denominator greater than 30, and if you have 60 feet, you can only use the 30 feet. You only get a ratio of 1. What else do I need? Sprinklers. Sprinklers are required based on a couple different criteria. One is based on size. And the magic numbers are 3. So if you're greater than 3 stories for an F1 or an S1, sprinklers are required. Next number is 12,000 square feet per fire area. On F1 and S1, if you're over 12,000 square feet per fire area, sprinklers are required. 24,000 feet, if all of your fire areas are over 24,000, sprinklers are required. And then you get into some interesting ones like mattress factories and storage of mattresses, which we've done. You don't want to see where all the recycled mattresses from Minneapolis goes. It's not pretty. It's really not up to code either, but they get into some areas where, yeah, if you have bulk tire storage. One that came up recently is if you have commercial motor vehicle storage or repair that exceeds 5,000 square feet. So commercial motor vehicle storage. Would you consider a loadout or receiving commercial vehicle storage? Anyone? No. Well, the state of Wisconsin does. And since we apply through the state of Wisconsin, when the state of Wisconsin says we see it this way, and we say, well, we don't see it this way, and they say we are the state of Wisconsin, we see it this way. There are alternatives. You can approach the ICC for an official ruling, but those rulings take a while. So for that project, we ended up putting in a divider wall to break that up into 2 fire areas so that your total fire area is less than 5,000 square feet. Why else would you need sprinklers? Area and use. So there are certain things, just because of the use, they require sprinklers. So H's. If you're an H, you have to sprinkler. If you are an R, all R's that are governed by the IBC. So remember, those are the big ones. The dormitories, hotels. Those are not your average home. Those are covered in the RC, the International Residential Code. But if you're in the IBC, all your R's are required to be sprinklered. Underground structures that are for human occupancy. So not our tunnels, because our tunnels are not for human occupancy. High pile storage, stories without openings. So if you exceed 1,500 square feet and you don't have openings every 50 feet, or if you're a basement more than 75 feet from an opening, So those are required by use. And then we have incidental use. Incidental use are those things that come up, right? Flammable finishes, furnace rooms, boiler rooms, battery storage. In addition to that, A's, E's, I's, M's all have square footage requirements. We don't get into those a lot, but they do have square footage requirements. B's, business, no use requirement for sprinkling. No square footage requirement for sprinkling. When was the last time you were probably in a B occupancy that wasn't sprinklered? Yeah, exactly. And I'm done, thanks. Yeah.
How about sprinklers in electrical rooms?
Sprinklers in electrical rooms. Yes. So if they're in a sprinkler building, that is required to be sprinklered. But in the NFPA 13, there's a regulation that says if it's just used for electrical equipment and you're not storing anything that's combustible in there, you can separate it with a 2-hour wall and not sprinkler it. Yeah, because the sprinklers and electricity is not good. That's the key takeaway, Dan, from this. Sprinklers and water, or sprinklers, electricity, bad. Any other questions? Yeah.
So how do you handle warehouses where you store a lot of wood pallets?
Wood pallet. Oh, yes. How do we handle warehouses that store a lot of wood pallets?
So you got a building that doesn't meet any of the requirements to be sprinkled.
Yep.
It's type 3, it's CMU block walls, but at any given time you could have 2 to 3 semi-loads of pallets.
So you're storing combustible product in there, which usually your standard thing that you're storing is non-combustible, right? In like food in a single wrapper that's not in a box within a box within a box is an S2, right? So you wouldn't be required. Typically, if you have that, you don't want to get into high pile storage, right? You don't want to get into an area where you have that stacked up where it's high above high pile storage. The fire official can say that now you have combustibles in that area and that portion is an S1 instead of an S2. They can require sprinkling, or they can require that your fire load be kept under a certain criteria, which is another seminar on well, Kelly may be able to talk to that later. Any additions?
Height is a big one.
Yeah.
And that loading is a big one. Yeah, I just navigated before the
Yeah. Yes. So
I was just more curious how you guys handle it.
typically, the things that we typically store. So the question was, how does VAA handle storage of wooden pallets in areas that are in S2? Typically, in the facilities that we're using for storage of S2. Our commodity is not always palletized, right? So our fertilizer is not always palletized. Seed gets into an interesting area. We've worked with seed before. See a few people smiling around here, frowning. Yes. But if you can't store them outside because of the wood and the weather, it is going to be a discussion point with the AHJ or the fire marshal.
So, sorry,
Yep.
in a lot of instances where, whether it's an electrical room or seed or some other product, if water did get in, it would be a big issue, or maybe there's some other constraint like a water line into the facility. We work in a lot of rural places. What is the tolerance from an AHJ of considering exemptions from some of these requirements?
So the question is, what are the exemptions from the AHJ for either the potential for loss of product or lack of water, right?
Yep.
We'll talk about that in a minute. So, what about fire doors? This is our example from before. We're considering this one building and this one building. We meet the area requirements, but say we want to have a door that goes through here. So now we have 20 feet, but there's an imaginary line through here, so we're 10 feet and 10 feet, so we're separated our current distance. Currently, right now, we don't have a firewall between these two, but as soon as you connect them, now you're closer than the 10 feet. And that would be a firewall because you're connecting two buildings that are not the same size, or not the same building. And that firewall is the type of system you use between those two. And then we'd have to go to table 706.4 that says that's going to be a 3-hour wall and a 3-hour door. But we considered this one building and this one building. And that's our approach. But if we take a different approach, what would happen if we consider it one building? So if we have one building, now we have 100% all the way around. That's over 30 feet, right? So we get the full 75 feet increase, or 75% increase. So now our 60,000 plus our 30,000 square feet, our allowable is 91,000. So we're taking the most restrictive use, which is the S2, because it has less allowable area. And by open frontage, we can call this, even though it's not connected, we can call this one building. And if you're one building, you can put a door here. Now, the math on this miraculously just works out, right? And it's not going to be like that in every situation. The key here is to look at how you approach the problem. Which path do you take? You could call this one building, you can call it two buildings if it works. You can use area percentages to try to make it work. The code official usually wants to see what route you took and if that route meets the code. And there's usually several different ways you can walk through the code. So remember we said that our maximum allowable fire area for an S1 or an F1 is 12,000 square feet. So if we have 20,000 square feet and we don't want to sprinkler it, the easiest thing to do is put up a fire barrier. So if you put up a fire barrier and you put it somewhere near the middle, make sure that this is not 12,000 and this is not 12,000, then we're okay. So a fire barrier for an S1, there again, 3-hour. So you put up a 3-hour wall, a 3-hour door, and you don't need the sprinkler. Now, we come into a lot of these situations where this was built, and at some point it gets added onto, and added onto, and added onto. We can't always control what we walk into, right? Some of these things have been grandfathered in, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So fire barrier is what we would use here. But what's the difference between a firewall, a fire barrier, and a fire partition? Fire partitions are the lowest level, right? So those are used for corridors, elevator lobbies. They're usually rated an hour. They can be all the way down to half an hour. Fire barriers are the ones that we use the most. So those are shafts, elevator enclosures, stairways, exits, horizontal access control areas. So if we're breaking a large area into little boxes of fire or hazard to eliminate our total quantity, it's a fire barrier. And fire barriers can range anywhere from 1 to 4 hours. Fire walls. Fire walls separate two buildings, whether they're actual wall-to-wall or if they're one wall and it's too close to another building. The issue with firewalls is they have to be structurally sound so that if either building on either side falls down, that firewall remains. And all of our structural engineers are thinking, well, it's not tricky, but it's usually expensive. So then if you have a firewall or a fire door or a fire partition or a fire barrier, you would go to this table, 716. 716 tells you that for each of these areas, if you have a rated wall that's 2 hour, and it's an exit enclosure stairway, you need an hour and a half. 3 is 3, usually 2 is 1.5, 1 is 1. But they use this table to figure out what the requirement is for your doors or openings. Fire-rated shafts, stairways, elevators. So if you're connecting 4 or more stories, it's 2 hour. If you're 3 or less, it's 1 hour. And this is where we remember that mezzanines and equipment platforms are not stories. Basements are, but equipment platforms and mezzanines are not stories. So let's take an example. We have a 3-story S1. We are separating our stair on these 2 sides because we're separating it from the building. There's nothing to separate it from out here, so these walls are not required to be fire rated. If we have an exterior stair, you have your firewall here, so on this would be 1 hour, and then you have a 1 hour extension for 10 feet. So if this was a 4-story, you'd have a 2 hour, but then this 10-foot extension is only required to be 1 hour. Now, sometimes when we do that, it's easier just to build that second part as 2 hour because you already have the materials coming. But those are the requirements. Allowable area, pay occupant. Yeah, I can't catch them all. This is what you need for egress. This also determines technically your number of employees that you will need for restrooms. More on that later. So there's a table that says that if you are an accessory or storage or mechanical, you divide by 300 square feet. If you're industrial or business, you are 100 square feet. If you're business and you're using the 2018, it's 150 square feet per person. So in 2018, you're allowed more space in an office per person than you are in an industrial facility. I can't explain it. I mean, it's the code, right? They determine the number of people you need, or the amount of area you need for egress. So we get this question quite a bit. Well, we're not going to have 43 people in our loadout. That's ridiculous. No, but you can egress 43 people out of your loadout. So the requirements you use are 0.2 for stairs per person and 0.3 inches, or 0.3 inches per stairs. I don't know. 0.3 and 0.2 in non-sprinklered, and 0.2 for stairs and 0.15 for doors in sprinklered. So there again, if you sprinkler, you can get more people out of your building. Usually, on the facilities that we do, the egress capacity isn't the driving factor. When you get into assembly, you're dividing by 15-ish. Gotta love the code. If you're doing a bowling alley, I can tell you exactly how many people it has, because it has requirements in a bowling alley for your approach lanes and for your bar area. But as close as they get to grain is industrial. Warehouses are great. I mean, that's 500 square feet per occupant. Spaces with one exit. We get into this quite a bit. We're only going to have 3 people up there. Will one exit work? Well, a couple of things that come into play. The occupancy that you're using and your common path of travel, and whether or not it's sprinklered. So with the sprinkler system, your common path of travel for a B, without. If your occupancy is less than 30, without a sprinkler system, you can go 100 feet. If you're without sprinkler and you're over 30, you can only go 75. The key ones to look at here, H. So if you have more than 3 people, you need 2 exits. And you need, with a sprinkler system, you have to be able to go right or left within 25 feet. Spaces with one exit based on height. So your first story, most of these can have one exit. Your second story, B's, F's, M's, and S's, criteria for one exit. Once you get to your third story, they're saying that you actually absolutely have to have 2 exits. So what's common path of travel? I should ask that question before I got to the slide. Common path of travel is how far you can go before you can go right or left. So if you're in the back of the room and you stand up, you can go right or left pretty quick. If you're in the front of the room, I have to make a choice about mid-room to go right or left. So if you're in a large conference room and you're in the back, your common path of travel is this blue line. At this point, you can go right or left. If you're in the large office, right, you can go right or left once you get to this point. So the common path of travel is one thing that we measure. And how far can you go before you reach an exit? That is travel distance. Remember when we said that the IBC was a collection of older codes? One older code said you could go 200 feet. One older code said you could go 300 feet. So the IBC says you can go 250. That was the logic. They have a meeting and they discuss and they say, well, no, it's got to be 200. No, it's got to be 250. Deal. And it's been 250. And it probably is not going to change. Those are pretty well set and haven't changed. Well, that one has changed. So your travel distance. So you're coming from your furthest point, and that's all the way to either grade or rated enclosure. You got to get to a safe exit. So rated enclosure is a safe exit. And where that helps us is if you're on the 6th story of a flour mill. Can you think you can get down in 250 feet? Probably not. So your stair is already a rated enclosure because you're over 2 stories, right? So you're 6 stories. So as long as you can get to that rated enclosure, that's when you stop your travel distance. You don't have to get all the way down. Any questions?
Travis, is that exterior stair considered a rated enclosure?
Yep. If you have the separation here and the extension.
Would a ladder be considered? Can you repeat it?
Oh, yes, repeat the question. Mark asked if an exterior stair can be considered a rated enclosure. And it can if you have a fire barrier between it and the building and an extension that is parallel. So if you have a fire here, they don't want the fire to lap in and cause you not to be able to go down. According to the IBC, fire doesn't turn 90 degrees or 180 degrees. So a fire on this side, you can still get down. And it's a real, people have debated these things for at least 20 some years. And yeah.
What about the ladder question?
The ladder question, does a ladder count as an exit? A ladder does not count as an exit per the IBC. Ladder does count as an exit per OSHA. So areas that are buildings that are governed by the IBC have to have egress per the IBC. In areas and structures that are governed by OSHA, you can have OSHA egress. And that is an entire different seminar. So that gets into what is a basement? What is a pit? Is a tunnel a pit? Is a tunnel a basement? Can we have a tunnel, which is a pit, next to a basement? Yeah, you can. What pitfalls do we encounter? Here's the fun stuff. Here's where I want to see a lot of comments, grinding rooms. So what we know is that they are an H if there's a hammer mill. Because a hammer mill does two things. It creates dust, and there's a potential for spark. Roller mills, typically we do not classify as an H. There's less dust, there's less room for a spark, and because 426 in the code specifically says hammer mill. I mean, you don't try to read a whole lot into the code when it says it's a hammer mill. Well, a roller mill is not a hammer mill, and we've been down that road many times. H's require sprinkling, black and white in the code. H occupancy require 2 means of egress if you have more than 3 people. So that's not a very big hammer mill room. So what do? Typically, we provide 2 exits. Typically, we provide the fire separation. And typically, we ask the AHJ, in the event that we have an issue in a hammer mill, the issue usually isn't a fire, it is deflagration, right? So it is a sub-sound barrier explosion, right? It doesn't break the sound barrier, but it is a flash. In a flash, your sprinklers become water features. They get destroyed. The things that you're trying to protect are typically in the hopper, they're typically in the grinder or in the plenum. Things that can't be reached by a sprinkler system. Things that are good to react to a deflagration event are fire pressure cannons, right? Now those have their own issues because now you have to test them and they're expensive. So you can sprinkler, or you can offer up alternative means that have been used throughout the industry. A lot of times on the smaller facilities, the sprinkler rooms are the only areas that are required to be sprinklered because of size or compartmentalization. And if you don't have fire water, are you going to put in a fire tank just to sprinkler that area? Or can you argue that a fire cannon is a better alternative to sprinklers? Sprinkling, why do we sprinkler? We've been through this. We use it because it's an H, or we use it because we want to increase area, or we want it to increase height. We want to increase common path of travel or your travel distance, or we want to sprinkler so we can reduce the ratings that are required. So if you sprinkler, you usually get, and other than H, you usually get a 1 hour break on your walls. So if you have a 2 hours required and you sprinkler, typically you can drop that down to a 1 hour. Why wouldn't we sprinkler, right? It's the best thing to do. If you have water, it's expensive. If you're sprinkling in a facility that is not heated, you're going to a dry system. Kelly can talk all about dry systems coming up. There are, we can compartmentalize portions of the building so the sprinkler isn't required, but we can only do so much. The code is going towards sprinklering. They like sprinklering. Yes, Alex?
Given that those sprinkler systems are expensive, with reference to the wall ratings, when does it become less expensive to sprinkler versus a higher rated wall?
The question was, since sprinkler systems are expensive and we may not have water issues or connection, when is it more cost effective to rate the wall rather than put in a sprinkler? There's a couple of answers. One, if you have an existing facility, is that one next? Tunnels. Existing conditions. If you have an existing condition, something that's been grandfathered in, our approach is not to fix all the ills from years past. You put up a firewall and you say, from this point on, we are code compliant. And this we will do the best we can with, right? In existing conditions, if you're trying to put up a firewall in a process-heavy area, you're dealing with existing pipes and conduits and ducts. And a lot of that stuff can't be taken down without, or replaced without a shutdown of the entire facility. So there's feasibility of, it's not necessarily the cost of the firewall, it's the feasibility, can we actually build a firewall? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just a follow-up question. How much more expensive is a 2-hour rated wall versus a 1-hour? And does it get exponentially more expensive as we add hours to the rating?
So the question was, how much more expensive is a 2-hour wall from a 1-hour wall? You can take a wall out of gypsum board, steel studs, a layer of 5/8 on one side, a layer of 5/8 on the other. That's 1 hour if it's type X. For the cost of another sheet of gypsum board, you put 2 on one side and 2 on the other, that's 2 hour. When you get into block, a block wall, CMU wall, 8 inches wide, is 1 hour. You can get a 2-hour block that has a thicker width wall and lay that up, same installation costs, and you have a 2-hour wall. You can take a 1 hour or standard CMU and put it up and fill the cores. Then you got a 4-hour wall, right? The cost difference between an IMP rated wall of 2 inches, or a 4-inch is a 2-hour wall. A 6-inch is a 2-hour wall. So between 1 and 2, there's not a big difference. You jump up to 3, there's usually a larger cost jumping up to 3-hour walls. We'll go back to tunnels. Tunnels are not basements. Tunnels are not occupied. They're occupiable, but they're not occupied, right? Words matter in the code. They're not occupied. How many people have been in a tunnel in an industrial facility? Would you want to occupy that? No, they're occupiable. There will be people down there, but areas that are just for maintenance and use, we usually try to have them governed by OSHA. We treat those similar to what we would do for a steam tunnel, okay? We did have an issue where we had a large series of bins, and the code official said, well, this is an S1, yes it is, and this is an S1, yes it is, and that's an S1, yes it is, and you're connecting it with a tunnel, yes we are. Where's your fire rating? There is no fire rating between those. They don't make a fire rated slide gate. Not that I know of, Mark. No. So they're saying, well, this is connected to the tunnel, which is connected to this, which is connected to this. You're exceeding your fire area. Then we bring in criteria from the grain industry saying that grain doesn't really burn, it smolders. And we go down that path. In Nebraska, we were doing work, and the fire marshal said, you must sprinkler your tunnel. Well, why? Because I made an interpretation They're saying you must sprinkler your tunnel. Okay. We did another job in Nebraska, and we're like, we're gonna have to sprinkle the tunnel. So we did that last time. But we couldn't find it on the state fire marshal website. So I called the state fire marshal, this is a new fire marshal, by the way. Said, hey, where are all the interpretations that used to be on the website? Yeah, about that. Apparently, the legislature in Nebraska said that those interpretations were changing the code without proper judicial review. So those are no longer enforceable. So we don't have to sprinkler the tunnel in Nebraska. Not now, until it goes through the proper judicial review. So in the future, might have to come back and sprinkler. But for right now, if we're doing projects in Nebraska, it's not required to sprinkler a tunnel. That's how fluid the code can be. Takeaways, we made it, right? Takeaways, yeah, IBC is used throughout the United States. Specific jurisdictions may have unique amendments. In Oregon, we were using the Oregon Specialty Structurals Code, which is their version of the building code. And we ran through a particularly hazardous project, and they said, well, you're not using Appendix N. No, we went to our book, we didn't have Appendix N, and we had just bought the code. And we said, we don't have Appendix N. Oh, it's just coming out. Well, what is Appendix N? Well, we got this idea where we took everything fire-related out of the building code and everything building-related out of the fire code, and we took them out of those two sections and we put it in Appendix N. Yeah. Okay, they didn't really change much. They just took it out of the code, put it in Appendix N. We get a copy of Appendix N, we go through, doesn't really change our approach, but we start referencing Appendix N, send it through the building department. Appendix N, that's really nice. Send it through the fire department. Yeah, we never adopted Appendix N. So jurisdictions, Chaska has a requirement that sprinklering anything over 2,500 square feet. Found out that one the hard way. Even though it's a foundry and you don't want to sprinkler foundries because bad things happen when things go on electric, bad things happen when water goes into molten steel. Still, we were supposed to sprinkler it. Well, fortunately, this person also had a foundry in St. Paul. The project in Chaska didn't go through. Other takeaways, the IBC really likes sprinkling. That's not going to go away. H occupancies require sprinkling. Exceptions are part of the code. Okay, there you get it's just an exception. No, it's written in the code. It's part of the code. Use it. Okay, and we've just touched upon a little bit. There are going to be a lot of questions. If in doubt, reach out. Okay, we've seen quite a few things, and we always like to hear those unique concerns or questions. Some links we can send out. These two are really good for finding codes. ICC will list what is the current code in each state. Upcodes lists what all the codes are because ICC covers all the I codes. Changes to the IBC, the 2021 NFPA codes and standards, that's going to address your sprinkling concern of mechanical or MCC rooms. And accessibility standards. That's me. Thank you.
So, yeah, give him a hand. Thank you, Travis. So before we go to questions, there's one that Wade had asked that I don't think you answered entirely. So he had asked what happens if you don't have water.
What happens if you don't have water? Kelly can get into that a little bit more. He's our sprinkler expert. The code, I have that.
They don't really care.
Yeah, The code doesn't care about the feasibility of your project. They don't. They're gonna say, it's the, they don't. They're worried about building and life safety, mostly life safety. Yeah. Yeah, you're gonna ruin $1 million worth of product. Yeah. Yeah, it's not their concern. Their concern is building safety. The fire deals with fire safety. Yeah, I think it was in the sprinklering.
All right, how
Yeah.
about other questions? Well, you must have done a really good job, Travis, very rarely, right?
All right, thank you.